let's start off with some remembrances, all right? We know who John Birch was, at least most of us, and I'm not going to go into that story, except maybe to tell you that when the Chinese guy directed John to go to the barge that was on the river there, where Doolittle and his crew were there, and John knocked on the door, "Are there any Americans in there?" And one of Doolittle's men said, "Don't open the door, it's a trap." And John persisted, "Are there any Americans in there? I'm an American." And finally, one of Doolittle's men said, "There ain't no guy in China that can speak with a sudden drawl. It has to be an American." So John Birch, of course, and Robert Welch wrote the story of the life of John Birch, and what a wonderful story that is. If you have any young people who have to do a biography for a school project, have them read the life of John Birch. Yeah? Right? That'll shake up the teacher, right? I had the good fortune of meeting George and Ethel Birch in their home, and it was perfectly obvious to me when I was there for about 2 minutes that it was Ethel who was the teacher. Much the same as Robert Welch, too. Robert Welch's mother was his great teacher. Not that his father wasn't, but the mother was much more of an influence in the educational realm, right? And she knew she had a prodigy on her hands, so she directed him correctly, and thank God she did, right? So it was quite a privilege to work alongside Robert Welch all those years. Now, what I want to do for a few minutes here is tell you about some of the heroes of the John Birch Society. I'm going to eventually talk a little bit about the Council on Foreign Relations, but we've got some wonderful heroes that not too many members, especially newer members, have ever even heard of, right? For instance, how many have ever heard of a man named Pedro Diaz-Lanz, right? That's not even half the audience. Pedro Diaz-Lanz was a Cuban, and he didn't like the Batista government that was corrupt, and there's no doubt about it was corrupt, but they weren't communists, so. But Diaz-Lanz was leader of one of the groups that wanted to get rid of Batista, and he became very friendly with Fidel Castro. In fact, he was Fidel Castro's pilot. They didn't have many planes, but Diaz-Lanz was one of his pilots. And Diaz-Lanz worked alongside and was very, very happy when Castro took control of Cuba on January 1st, 1959. And 6 months later, he fled Cuba. He'd found out what Castro was all about. And he came to the United States. And he very quickly found the John Birch Society, and he spent the next 10, 12 years of his life touring the country, speaking about what's happening, what happened in Cuba, and the fact that the government of the United States knew, because he had by then found out that Robert Welch had already written that Castro was a communist before Castro took control of Cuba. And if private citizen Robert Welch knew that Castro was a communist, then certainly the U.S. government knew. And there's a lot more detail on that, but I won't get into it, except to say this, that Diaz-Lanz used to tell any audience that if there had been one chapter of the John Birch Society in Havana, Castro never would have taken control of Cuba. Right. Just one. And I believe that. So that man gave up an awful lot of his life for the John Birch. He's passed on now. He gave up an awful lot of his life. And it's somebody that we ought to know and we ought to respect, right? Now, let me ask, how many have ever heard of the name Delmar Dennis? Oh, a few more. Okay. Well, who was he? Well, Delmar Dennis was a young preacher in Mississippi. And he was a member of the John Birch Society. And Delmar Dennis was there when the 3 civil rights workers were murdered in a community called Philadelphia, Mississippi. And immediately the authorities were able to go to an earthen dam and dig up the bodies that had been placed in this place and start to build a case for who committed the murders. So obviously the authorities had an informer within the Klan who told them where to go to find the bodies, right? Well, 3 years after the death of those men, the trial was held, and the star witness at the trial was Delmar Dennis. And Delmar Dennis happened to have a distinction. He was the only member of the John Birch Society who had ever been allowed to be in the Klan. We had a hard and fast rule. If you want to be in the Klan, we don't want you, right? If you want to join the Birch Society, you got to quit the Klan. We didn't want to have anybody in the Klan. But he got a special permission because the FBI had asked him to get into the Klan and to become an informer. And he put his life on the line, right? So at the trial, 3 years after the death of those 3 workers, Delmar Dennis's wife left him. Her father was a big Klansman. Delmar Dennis, alone in his own home, was getting shot at every night. He had to sleep in the kitchen. Delmar Dennis finally went on a speaking tour for the John Birch Society throughout the country. Maybe he came to here in Ohio, I don't know. I don't remember. But I know this, that everywhere he went, he was telling people about how the leaders of the Klan in Mississippi were boasting of their affiliation with communism. Now, you've been told, and everybody's been told, that the Klan, they're right-wingers. Yeah, sure, right? One of the other lies that we've been told. Right? So Delmar Dennis, we hired him now full-time as a coordinator for us. He worked in California for a while, and then we decided to bring him back to Mississippi. And we made him our coordinator in the state of Mississippi. And there was a good member there who said that this is a wonderful move, and now we will have a conflict between 2 organizations, one of which will triumph and the other will completely disappear. Well, the Klan hasn't completely disappeared, but I can say without any hesitation that the John Birch Society did more to suppress the Ku Klux Klan in the United States than all other organizations combined. Delmar eventually left our staff, and he left Mississippi. He moved up to Tennessee, and I heard that he wasn't well. But at the 25th anniversary of the Birch Society, I was standing in the back of the room listening to some of the speakers, and a guy nudged over to me and hit me with his elbow and said, "Aren't you going to say hello?" It was Delmar. I said, "I'm so glad you came." Now, that was in December of 1983, and it was only a few weeks before Robert Welch had his crippling stroke that led to his death. And it was the last public appearance that Robert Welch ever made, right? And Delmar said, "I had to come and say goodbye to the boss." That was a very nice sentiment. And Delmar Dennis now himself has passed away, right? But he's another one of our heroes. Now, I think that probably even more people here from Ohio remember Julia Brown, right? Julia Brown lived in Cleveland, excuse me, in Cleveland. And she was kind of concerned about the way black Americans were being treated in our country, so she went and joined a civil rights organization. And in very short order, she found out that she had actually joined the Communist Party, and she didn't know it. So being a good American and an honorable person, she went to the FBI and she told them. She said, "They told me it was a civil rights organization. It's the Communist Party." And the FBI said, "And you joined?" "Yes, I did. And I'm here to confess." "I'm here to apologize." They said, "Well, we'd like very much for you to stay in that organization and to tell us what they're doing and what their activities are and so on." So for 10 long years, she worked as a double agent within the Communist Party. Well, it got to a point where there was a trial of some of the communist leaders and so forth, so they brought her as a star witness. In other words, they exposed her activity, and she had to leave Cleveland. Right? Some of the comrades were not very comradely at this point. Right? So she left there, and she went on a tour around the country. I can't imagine. She probably spoke in all 50 states. Right? And Julia Brown got better and better as a speaker. She was terrific. Right? She could hold an audience. I remember one time being down in a place called Sandersville, Georgia, and we were meeting at the home of a Baptist preacher. And there we were. I was there. I'm a Roman Catholic. He's a Baptist preacher. Alan Stang was there, a Jewish American, and Julia Brown, you know. And the preacher finally said, he said, "Here I have gathered in my own kitchen, sitting around my own table, a Catholic, a Protestant, a black, a Jew, and it didn't matter. We're all Americans, and we're trying to save our country." Okay? Julia Brown spoke at a council meeting. We only had one council meeting in all these years, and it was in Washington, D.C. And it was arranged by Larry McDonald, right? The late Larry McDonald, right? I hate to say that, but have to. And Julia's speech so impressed some of the members of the council and Robert Welch himself that Larry got a hold of the text of her speech and put it in the congressional record. It was a speech called "Americans Stop Thinking Like Communists." And she knew. She knew that so many Americans were thinking as communists were thinking, and she didn't like it. So there's another hero. She's passed on as well, right? I'm talking about past heroes. Now, we have current heroes too, and I'm not going to get into them except to say that there are a lot of heroes in the John Birch Society, and we want so much to treasure them and to revere them and to let them know how much we appreciate them. And in fact, you can do that by looking in the mirror. If you're a member of the Birch Society, you can congratulate whoever you see in the mirror, right? Now, I'm supposed to talk about the Council on Foreign Relations. That's not my favorite topic. I'd love to give you more stories of heroes in the Birch Society, but anyhow, we move on. The Society just recently issued a new booklet that I wrote called America and the United Nations. And this is how we got into the UN and why we should get out, right? And there's information in there that some of the veteran members of the Society have read and said they never heard that before, or they didn't know anything about that. So let me urge you to go and get yourself a copy over at the, what they call the hospitality suite. We got in the United Nations because of a man named Edward Mandell House, right? And I consider Edward Mandell House the arch conspirator of the 20th century, right? This guy was a dynamo for the other side, for the wrong purposes. And it was he who put the idea for a League of Nations in the mind of Woodrow Wilson. And he would suggest all kinds of things to Wilson, and maybe a week, 10 days later, Wilson would come up with the idea, and House would say, "Wonderful idea, Mr. President, wonderful idea. Let's go ahead with that," right? That's part of the way he operated. He was a very clever man. But he was the puppeteer, and Wilson was the puppet. There's no doubt about that. Well, at the end of World War I, we had the gathering for the treaty to end the war. Oh, aren't you nice? Is it just water, I hope?
Not telling.
You know, I'm Irish. Thank you very much. Well, part of the Versailles Treaty that they came up with was the League of Nations. And that, of course, is one of the things that Edward Mandell House talked about in the book he wrote in 1912 called Philip Drew, Administrator. Art Thompson talked a little bit about that today. Philip Drew, Administrator is a book that you want to understand what's happened to us in the 20th century, you should read that book, because he called for an income tax. He called for the Federal Reserve. He called for what he called a comity of nations. We don't use that word much anymore. C-O-M-I-T-Y. What it is a union of nations, and it's a world government. That's what he wanted. House despised the U.S. Constitution and its limitations. He didn't want that. So he also said he was working for socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. Okay, you know enough about Edward Mandell House at this point to know he's not He's not a candidate for the John Birch Society. Right? So at the end of World War I, the Senate debated the matter for 9 months, whether or not to approve U.S. entry into the League of Nations. And after 9 months, they said no. No. We should be very grateful for that. Right? If they had succeeded in 1919 with the League of Nations, I don't know what would have happened to our country in the succeeding years. So what happened is that House and his lieutenants, his aides that were working on the Versailles Treaty over in Paris, they got together with British counterparts and they formed respective organizations for their own countries to promote the idea of world government, to convince the public that this is what you want. So the Americans created the Council on Foreign Relations, the British, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. So the godfather of the Council on Foreign Relations is Edward Mandell House. And he's also the godfather of the United Nations. Right? And we make that clear in the booklet. Right? Now, House and Wilson, at that point, had a falling out. Wilson went around the country trying to promote the idea of a League of Nations, and he worked so hard at it that he ruined his health and spent the last year or more of his life as president as practically a cripple, mentally and physically. Right? But the momentum continued to go. So House had told him, the thing we should do is not go for the whole enchilada. What we should do is get something on the books and we'll fix it later. Right? That's exactly what they did regarding the Federal Reserve. Exactly. Got something there and then they kept fixing it, and now we're in the fix, as you all know. So House was the man who was responsible for that. And the Council on Foreign Relations was eventually incorporated fully in New York in 1921, and they started publishing their own magazine, Foreign Affairs Magazine. Foreign Affairs Magazine in December of 1922 came out very boldly and said, the real problem in the world is we don't have a world government. What we need is a world government. So they made it very clear. And the Council on Foreign Relations has always promoted the idea of world government. Scrap the Constitution, get rid of the limitations on government, let's have a world government that we will run. Right? And a lot of these people have never been communists, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter to them, it didn't matter to me. So the Council on Foreign Relations began to get tremendous financing from the big foundations, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and so forth. And then an interesting thing happened in 1932, and that was Franklin Roosevelt winning the nomination of the Democrats at a convention in Chicago on a platform that was quite moderately conservative. It would have appealed, much of it, to even people in this room in 1932. And Roosevelt said, of course, I'm backing that well, he just discarded it as soon as he became the president. But the convention nominated him. He's now the nominee of the Democrat Party, 1932. And he left Chicago and went back east. His home was in New York. And he went right past New York. He went up to a little community at Gloucester, Massachusetts called Magnolia to visit an old man who was in his dotage, Edward Mandell House. And that's where Franklin Roosevelt went to visit. Franklin Roosevelt was as much a disciple of Edward Mandell House as was Woodrow Wilson. Right? That's not known very much, but it certainly is important and it's true. And he was a disciple of House because Franklin's mother had given him a copy of Philip Drew in 1920. She was a friend of Edward Mandell House. Right? So here he wanted a comity of nations. Well, House died in the late 1930s. He never saw the United Nations actually get fixed. But what we saw was a contingent of the Council on Foreign Relations in 1939 was invited themselves into the State Department, and it was financed by one of the big liberal foundations, the Rockefellers, and they virtually took over the State Department in 1939. We weren't even in the war at the time. The war had just started. But they had a great influence. Well, then Pearl Harbor came, and Pearl Harbor was the crisis out of which they always get some of their things. Was it Rahm Emanuel who said a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, right? Don't waste a crisis. So they didn't waste Pearl Harbor. And that happened on December 7th, 1941, as you probably know. Within 1 month, right after the first of the year, a group of our diplomats, so-called, our traitors, got together with some others, and they started working on the United Nations. Now, there was no United Nations, but the first time the term was being used was 1 month after Pearl Harbor. And it was the CFR types that did it. We find out later on that at the founding conference in 1945, there were 43 members of the Council on Foreign Relations in the U.S. delegation. And there were 16 actual communists, including Alger Hiss, who was the Secretary General of the founding conference, right? Was this a pro-American organization? No. I'm not going to get into much of the United Nations except to say it's time to leave. Now, how does the Council on Foreign Relations work? Well, first of all, there are only about 4,500 members, right? There have been hundreds in each of the last 6, 8, 10 administrations, right? And all in key positions. What's interesting is to go back over the members of the people who held the position of Secretary of State since the 1940s. And since the 1940s, there's only been one Secretary of State who wasn't a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and it was Hillary Clinton. It didn't matter. It didn't matter. You may recall that Hillary Clinton, while Secretary of State, went to the new building that the CFR now has in Washington, and she was one of the first speakers. She went to the Council on Foreign Relations branch office, I guess we could say. It's in Washington, D.C. And she said, "It's wonderful to have the Council here. Now I don't have to go so far to know what to say and how to think." She actually said that, right? A good friend of mine has it on the video of her saying that, and I think we have it in Appleton, right? Well, we ought to use that. I think we ought to use that, like we use Cheney's remark about he'd been a member of the CFR for a long time, but he didn't tell the people back in Wyoming when he was running for Congress, right? So every Secretary of State has been a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, all right? Now, I mentioned before that House and his young lieutenants in 1919 had conceived the idea of forming something to help persuade the American people to want world government, right? Who were his lieutenants? Well, they were Republicans. John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, Christian Herter, Sumner Welles, and then newspaperman Walter Lippmann, who was a very, very potent force in this country for bad for many, many years. Now, there are people who tell me, well, what we got to do is we got to get more Republicans in the Congress. No, no, no. We got to get more Americans in the Congress, right? Now, if you're a bright young fellow and you're you've won political office and you've demonstrated that you've got some ability and maybe some charisma and so forth, somebody will approach you and ask you if you'd like to read some important information, say a pamphlet from Foreign Affairs magazine, something like that. And I'll talk to you again in a few, maybe next time we meet in another couple of weeks, we can talk about it, right? So if you're ambitious and your morals are questionable and your morals are, you don't care much about it, you're just ambitious and you want to make something, you want to move ahead and so forth, you'll read the information and you'll regurgitate it the next time you meet this fellow, and pretty soon you'll be invited to join the Council on Foreign Relations, right? That's the way it works. And if you're really rabidly ambitious and so forth, you'll move up the chains and pretty soon you're a cabinet official or something else, right? And this has happened over and over and over again, right? Those people aren't conspirators. They're the people who do the work of the conspiracy. Maybe some of you remember the film we used to have years ago, we still have it, Anarchy USA, where we quoted Lenin, communism must be built with non-communist hands, right? The conspiracy's goal towards total control of the planet Earth must be built with non-conspiratorial hands. It's the same thing, right? And they get an awful lot of people doing their work. And some of these young fellows, some of them begin to figure it out. They move up the line, and then maybe they get invited to speak to the council and so on. And that's the way it works. There are very few conspirators. There are very many ambitious cretins. You like that word? I do. I like that word. Right? But there is a conspiracy. There's no doubt about that. So we move on now. Let's take a quick look at some of the men in the current administration here. We have one of the more detestable human beings, in my view, a man named John Kerry, who's now our Secretary of State. John Kerry was a member of the Skull and Bones Society at Yale, and I'm not going to get into detail on that except to say that it's a recruiting ground for conspiratorial activity. Right? And some of the other people who've been a part of that are the two Bush presidents that we had, and one of my favorite nemesis, that's William F. Buckley, Jr., right? If you haven't read my book on William Buckley, you might want to. And it shocks a lot of people, right? So Skull and Bones people, incidentally, are told that if the subject ever comes up when they're in the room, they are required to leave the room, right? So it's secret, and they don't talk about it. Kerry's been involved in several secret organizations. He's been involved in the Council on Foreign Relations and in the Skull and Bones Society and some other things as well. Now, John Kerry was very ambitious, and that's what they look for. And so he knew he was going to be drafted by the Army, and so instead he went and he entered the Navy instead, and he was commissioned as an ensign, and he went to Vietnam as the commander of one of the Swift boats. And some of you have read about this, or we even published some of it recently in the New American. And he showed up with a movie camera because he wanted to take pictures of him being in action. He's a great hero of the war and so on. He never went anywhere without his movie camera. And he's having people take pictures of him. And then he finally earned 3 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star under unusual circumstances, right? Well, the facts are that none of the Purple Hearts were deserved, and the Silver Star was awarded when he claimed that the actions of others were his, right? So he's a total fraud, right? He also knew that 3 Purple Hearts gave him the ability to leave the combat area. He didn't have to stay in Vietnam if he had 3 Purple Hearts. The first Purple Heart he got was for a nick on his arm caused by a fragment of a grenade that he himself had thrown. There was no enemy fire, and that's a requirement for receiving that award, right? The second came because of an attack he provoked when he decided to use psychological operations rather than attack and destroy a Viet Cong village. The third Purple Heart resulted from another ignorant use of a hand grenade. Bits of rice that Kerry and his buddy had targeted, they threw the grenades, they hit the bits of rice, and some of the bits of rice and pieces of the grenade flew back at him, and he had a superficial wound in his buttocks. The guy who was with him described the scene as hilarious. And for that, he got his 3rd Purple Heart. So with 3 Purple Hearts, he was eligible for early release from the combat zone, something he spent great energy to achieve. Back in the United States, he affiliated with the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, a left-wing, pro-communist outfit containing Black Panthers and other members of the Trotskyite Socialist Workers' Party. He then donned his fatigues, and he had, you're not supposed to wear the fatigues in public back then, and he put the medals on them, and you're not supposed to ever put your medals on fatigues, right? And he, and he testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, headed by J. William Fulbright of Arkansas. He condemned all who served in Vietnam, and he listed a whole listing of war crimes being committed by American troops. It was all a total lie, absolutely. But he said of these troops, these fellow troops that he was with, that they personally raped, they cut off ears, they cut off heads, they taped wires from portable telephones to genitals and turned up the power. They cut off limbs, they blown up bodies, they randomly shot at civilians, they razed villages in a fashion reminiscent of Genghis Khan, they shot cattle and dogs for fun, they poisoned food supplies, and they generally ravaged the countryside. He said that of his comrades in Vietnam. And it was all a lie, every bit of it, right? Claiming that he had himself even committed the same types of crimes, he would later backtrack when he was running for president in 2004, saying that those were the words of an angry young man, right? Yeah. He presented no evidence to back it up. Returning POWs testified that they were forced to listen to Kerry's testimony while imprisoned in filthy jails in North Vietnam. Right? The taping of his testimony before the U.S. Senate was played in the jails in Vietnam, holding our own people. Right? This guy almost became president. Right? What we got instead was George W. for a second term. Didn't matter, really. Didn't matter. His fraudulent testimony led to more maltreatment of our troops who were in the prisons in North Vietnam. And then he threw his medals into a trash bin at the Capitol. Right? He then broke the law by negotiating with high-ranking member of the communist government in North Vietnam. No American citizen should negotiate with a foreign power to begin with, and especially one that we're engaged in mortal combat with. So John Kerry is now the Secretary of State. Right? God bless America. Please, we need it. We need help, right? Now you have a man who's the Secretary of Defense named Chuck Hagel, H-A-G-E-L. He's a native of Nebraska. He served in the Army in Vietnam War alongside his brother. Both were wounded, both were decorated, honorably so. These two were good soldiers, right? In 1971 to 77, he was a staff member for Representative John McAllister, a congressman from Nebraska. He then spent 3 years as a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. He backed Ronald Reagan for president in 1980 and was awarded with a post in the Veterans Administration. But he left government and started a cell phone company, which was very successful. He sold it to AT&T and became a millionaire by selling his cell phone company. In 1992, he went back to Nebraska. Now he's a millionaire. Right? In 1996, he won a seat in the United States Senate from Nebraska. He served 2 terms. In 2000, this ambitious, bright, personable individual was asked to and accepted membership in the in the Council on Foreign Relations, right? So Chuck Hagel is another one, right? He's one that got tapped. Now, he's a Republican so far, right? And he's in the Barack Obama administration as Secretary of Defense, right? Well, I don't know how much defense he's going to arrange, right? So Hagel made himself available for Obama, took a trip to Afghanistan before the 2008 election, and his accompanying him as a Republican was seen as an endorsement for Obama, right? He's now a director of the anti-nuclear Global Zero. He wants the United States to join the UN's International Criminal Court. He backs ratification of the Law of the Sea Treaty and so on. He has completely sold out, right? And if he hadn't completely sold out, he wouldn't be the Secretary of Defense, right? And then we have now a Secretary of the Treasury named Jacob Jack Lew, L-E-W. He's born in New York City in 1955. He graduated from Harvard and Georgetown Law School. He was an aide to Congressman Joe Moakley and Speaker Tip O'Neill. He went into private practice in Boston. And then he got into the Clinton administration. He became the deputy director of the Office of Management and Budget. He taught at NYU. He was paid $840,000 a year as a professor at NYU. You wonder why college tuitions are high? He became a chief operating officer at Citigroup as an investment banker. See, he was now a millionaire. He received over $900,000 in bonuses while Citi was receiving its TARP funds, its bailout money. They gave a big chunk of it to Joseph Jack Lew, right? During confirmation to be Secretary of Treasury, he was asked about his investments in the Ugland Group. He said he didn't know anything about it, which was a lie. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Brookings Institutions. Now, I could go on and on and on, and I'm not going to. I'm gonna wind this up and repeat what I said before, that most of the people who are in the CFR are not conspirators. They're untrustworthy, self-promoting scoundrels, right? Amen. They will do whatever it takes to be favored by the above people, right? And there are really very few conspirators, but they are in charge, right? Art Thompson put up on the screen a quote from David Rockefeller's memoirs, right? Some people, he said, have accused my family of being part of a cabal, part of a conspiracy to bring about world government. If that's the charge, I agree, and I'm proud of it, he said, right? Well, thank you, David. That's going to be very helpful for us over the years. So what I've tried to do here today is just touch on a little bit of the Council on Foreign Relations. I want to urge you to go get the reprint, the Council on Foreign Relations Influencing the U.S. Government, or even better, to get a copy of James Perloff's marvelous book, The Shadows of Power. Right? People ask me, what's the best book I can read? Now, I've written 5 or 6 books, and I would love everybody to read my books, right? But if somebody comes to me and said, what's the best book I can read? What's the first and the best? I'd say, you get James Perloff's The Shadows of Power, and that will help you to understand what's happening to your country and what can be done about it. So they have that at the Hospitality Suite. They have the Council on Foreign Relations reprint. They have my little booklet about the United Nations that I guarantee you'll find some information in there you've never seen before, including the excerpts of the speeches of the 2 senators who voted against our entry into the United Nations in 1945. The vote in the United States Senate was 89 in favor and 2 opposed. Just 2, right? And I know why. Because I was old enough in 1945, and my own father was saying what so many Americans and so many senators were saying, we got to do something new, we got to try something new, let's give this a try. Okay? We already had World War I, we already had World War II, we don't want World War III, so we got to give something else a try, and that's how the United Nations was sold. It was sold to my dad, who was a very patriotic American, and it was sold to a lot of other people as well. It was the media that did it, the media even then controlled in large part by the Council on Foreign Relations. So hit the book table, and then we'll have a nice dinner tonight where you'll get to hear a good friend of ours, Larry Pratt, talk about his experiences in trying to protect the right to keep and bear arms. I'd like to make one comment about the Second Amendment. My one comment is the most important word in the Second Amendment is necessary. A well-regulated militia being necessary to a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The most important word. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.